Dobrodošli u Politološki podkast. U Politološkom podcastu razgovaramo sa politolozima i znanstvenicima iz srodnih disciplina o njihovim istraživanjima, objavljenim radovima te temama kojima se bave u svom znanstvenom radu. U ovoj epizodi podcasta Marko Grdešić, glavni urednik Anala Hrvatskog politološkog društva, razgovara sa Hellen Yaffe, profesoricom latinoameričke političke ekonomije sa sveučilišta u Glasgowu.
Hello, Professor Yaffe. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about your research on Cuba. Let me start first by asking you about what you feel are some of the largest misconceptions when it comes to Cuba for people like us coming from a Western point of view. And connected to that, what are some of the hurdles when somebody like you tries to do research on Cuba?
Wow, that's a big question. So, English language academic literature on Cuba is dominated by an academic school called Cubanology. And they actually self-nominated themselves Cubanology at a conference in the Library of Congress in 1970. And Cubanology has some key tenets. So you can have Cubanologists who are more from the right or more from the left, but they share these key tenets. And these key ideas about Cuba have dominated sort of Western knowledge and political commentary. So they are, for example, that the revolution of 1959 was like interrupted a historical process of Cuban development, right? So Cuba was on the road to what what's his name? Rostow, thank you, called the takeoff stage, right? So, you know, Cuba, that progress was interrupted by the Cuban Revolution. That Fidel Castro and later Raúl Castro were synonymous with the revolution. So all decisions, all new ventures, all new policies were Fidel's decisions or Raúl's decisions. There's no civil society. It's completely repressed. There's no democracy. Cuba's a dictatorship. Again, you know, we have these bearded men making all the decisions. Apparently they know about everything that's happening in every corner. Also, in the period when the Soviet Union still existed, that Cuba's international interventions, its internationalism was acting at the behest of the Soviet Union, so that the Cubans were a satellite state. And these, as I said, these key tenets, you know, define the paradigm of Cubanology. And I think that a lot of my work has been to try and challenge those key tenets. But on the other side, there's also a tendency to see Cuba as such an exception. So it's Cuban exceptionalism, right? So what happens in Cuba can't be replicated anywhere else. That, you know, what Cuba's achieved in health and education and so on, which is extraordinary, is sort of not relevant to talk about because Cuba's such an outlier. And the other aspect of my work has been trying to locate Cuba within a broader framework of understanding the challenge of development for underdeveloped countries like which are the majority countries in the world, the global south, which have been subject to hundreds of years of colonialism and imperialism. So understanding that when the Cubans chose revolution and state planning and state control and the investments in health and education, it's because that, in other words, they chose socialism. It's because they saw socialism as the best solution to those historical development challenges. So those have been the sort of big blocks. I feel like in the last 10, 20 years, Cubanology has become less dominant, because there are new young researchers who are, from the West, right? I'm not talking about the Cubans, because of course they're doing, their own thing, but who are doing research on Cuba that is kind of outside Cubanology. They don't have such a political agenda. They're interested in studying Cuba as a country with people, not as a dogma and as an ideology or part of the Cold War. That doesn't mean that those researchers don't come from their own precepts, if they have a concept of what democracy is, for example. And democracy is a multi-party electoral system, usually with a capitalist economy. And they look at Cuba and they say, well, that doesn't exist, therefore there's no democracy in Cuba. So I think those are the key kind of paradigms. And yeah, that's been where I've located my work, because so much of what's happened in Cuba, such extraordinary developments, are not well known in the West. And I think that's what I was trying to do with my latest book.
So speaking of which, your book, We Are Cuba, looks at the way Cuban society and its political system actually function. So in that respect, how would you say that the ways the Cuban regime pursues democratic legitimacy differs from what we usually think when we say democracy? We usually have multi-party elections in mind, but they obviously don't have quite that system, but they do have some sort of democratic legitimacy. So how do they go about this in the daily workings of the system?
So I've just submitted and waiting for the publication of a chapter on Cuban democracy and participation in revolutionary Cuba, which is coming out in a new book edited by Anna Kladnick on socialist democracy. And I point to 5 mechanisms of Cuban democracy. I, by the way, do not regard Cuba as a dictatorship, and I don't refer to it as a regime. Like many people who've actually studied the system of elections and representation and participation, I've concluded that Cuba is extremely democratic in the original sense of democracy, right, of people's power. So the 5 mechanisms of democracy in Cuba is the very comprehensive national system of people's power, which starts with elections on the level of street committees. These are rotating elections where the majority of Cubans participate and have some experience at some point of serving. A lot, not majority, but a lot of Cubans have experience of being the representatives. They're accountable and so on. I'll get to that in a minute. So that works at the neighborhood level, the municipal level, the provincial level, and the national level. I remember going into a mountainous rural area of Cuba near Guantanamo, which, as you know, is legally occupied by the United States, and speaking to their local representative, who was a black Cuban woman. And we asked her, how close do you feel to the center of power? And she said, I am in the centre of power because I go to the national parliament and I am one of the, at that time there was 600 and so on members of the national delegates in the National Assembly, which is the highest decision-making body in Cuba. The second mechanism of democracy is the neighbourhood representation. So this starts very early on with the street committees that are set up, and they're in every street. And they start out necessary for vigilance, because this is the era just after the revolution where there's a lot of sabotage and terrorism that is being supported from the United States and funded and organised from the United States, and an internal opposition. Later on, they set up people's councils during a moment of crisis. So when the collapse of the Soviet bloc happens and Cuba's GDP plummets by a third, there's scarcity of everything. And this is something that's also a characteristic. In moments of crisis, the Cuban state has responded by deepening democracy, giving Cuban citizens more responsibility and more resources to, take control of their own community. So that's really interesting. The third mechanism of democracy in Cuba is national debates and consultations. So, I mean, there's many examples, but very recently we've had national referendums about a new constitution which was approved in 2019. But the process of before the referendum was a process in which millions of Cubans went to debates organised in their neighbourhoods, in their workplaces, in their study centres, cultural centres, where they debated and argued, and many elements of the constitution were amended in a response to the opinions of the Cuban population. So it's not a paper exercise, it's real ability to have leverage. And then the other recent example was a similar process that happened and actually was very strong debate. It was in relation to the new Families Code, which was very controversial to some elements of Cuban society, which are still very affected by sort of chauvinist attitudes or Catholicism and so on, because it gave progressive rights for LGBTQ plus and is recognised now as one of the most progressive pieces of legislation in the world. So that's the third. The fourth is the organisations of the masses, and these actually really are key for mobilising people from the very early 1960s. Some of them predate the revolution, like the University Federation and the trade unions. There are 19 independent trade unions in Cuba, where the members, they're funded through members' contributions and so on. And I could we'd be here for hours, but I could give many examples of where they've had leverage on policy, where they have actually been able to stop a policy that's been implemented, to say they're not happy with the impact on workers and so on. So the organisations of the masses include workers and students, as I said, then also small farmers, Women's Federation. You also have the Union of Young Communists. You have pioneers who are children between 7 and 14 and unbelievably have a seat at the table for any discussions on national policy, and then the high school students as well. So the fifth mechanism of democracy, I would argue, is democratic access to resources and opportunities. So that is the fact that Cuba has free, universal access to healthcare and education at any level. You can be in your 70s and you decide you want to study, biochemistry, and you can go to the university for free. That's guaranteed. It's in the Constitution. But another way to look at this is in terms of living standards. So a recent study by Jason Hickel, who's a sort of social anthropologist, does a lot on the environment, assessed the Cuban system of food distribution and the low rate of malnutrition and the low rate of death from malnutrition in Cuba as a result of it, and then compared that to other countries around the world within a small period. I believe it was 1990 to 2015. Their study concluded that 16 million people had died around the world because they didn't have the Cuban system of food distribution. So, this is an element of democracy which is excluded from discussions about democracy in neoliberal countries, in capitalist countries, where it's all about liberal, liberal economics. It's the sort of politics to go with liberal economics. So, yeah, you have the right, you have freedoms to do this and that, but there's no discussion about having the resources, right? Having the material conditions to be able to fulfill those freedoms.
You mentioned briefly what is called the special period. So this is the period after the Soviet Union collapsed and Cuba found itself in a very precarious situation. How did Cuba survive this period?
Well, that's the sort of subtitle of my book, How a Revolutionary People Have Survived into a post-Soviet world. And one chapter, a key chapter of the book, is about the special period. So I break it down into the sort of, why was Cuba so vulnerable? Cuba was particularly vulnerable to the collapse of the Soviet bloc. It was had more state ownership than other countries in the socialist bloc. It was extremely dependent on the Soviet Union mainly, but also other socialist bloc countries for trade and investment. So that collapsed, like 86 and 87% fall in investment and trade. And so now in this new context, the Cubans have to reinsert themselves into international capitalist market dominated by the United States, which has openly declares its intention to destroy the Cuban Revolution and to, revert the country back to capitalism and to semi-colonial domination. So, I mean, the story of how Cuba survived is really rather extraordinary, and it merits examination. So we can look at the economic measures that were taken. The reinsertion into the international economy happened on the basis of services exports, so tourism first, and then the export of professional services, which are mainly medical services. And then you can look at the way that the state, just basically made the decision that it wouldn't follow the domino effect and transition to capitalism, and understood that in order to preserve socialism, you had to have the commitment of the population. They couldn't be forced into accepting socialism in those circumstances. You had to, use politics and ideology and to convince the population, but you also had to alleviate the, worst elements of shortage and suffering and so on. So the government, even while the economy shrank, it actually increased the social investments in keeping people fed and keeping people employed. Sometimes they didn't have productive work because industries had collapsed. But, the function of work in Cuba is more than just what they produce, right? It's a political forum. It's a place where people go and they have food. So they have free lunches or free breakfasts and so on. They organize, they have social events together. So they kept people in employment. There's a graph that I've got in my book, which is rather extraordinary. I don't think you'd see this from anywhere in the world. And it has 2 lines. So one line is the GDP, which absolutely plummets from, 1990. It's already going down before the collapse of the Soviet bloc, because the Soviet Union stopped providing Cuba with goods contracted pre-agreed preferential prices and went to market prices. So it collapses, but at the same time, a line for employment goes up. So, in any capitalist country, if you have a recession, unemployment goes up. And in Cuba, actually, the opposite happened. So they protected people through employment. So these incredible measures, but also equally, the measures that came from the bottom up. So the fact that people saw empty plots of land and started to sow fruit and vegetables, which were for them and their neighbours, and then the neighbourhood got involved, and that sparked an urban agricultural movement, which really took off nationally. The government saw it, appreciated it, and helped it to spread. They organised for the old farmers, the old campesinos, as they say, peasants in Cuba, who had experience from decades before, to go around to cooperatives and small, private farmers and teach them how to use oxen instead of tractors, because the tractors were left to rust. They had too many tractors per capita anyway, but they were left to rust. There was no fuel, there was no chemical fertilizers, so they had to learn to use organic techniques and all the rest of it. So it's an incredible story of a society finding collective solutions to daily problems. Hitchhiking was another one. So a rule came in that anyone who had a state vehicle, so the state had given people a car, or, there were state trucks, when they came to the amarillo, which is the person who stands at the side of the road wearing a yellow uniform with a clipboard, they had to stop and say where they were going. And the person with the clipboard knew where the hitchhikers were their destinations, and they'd say, right, those of you who are going to Pinar del Rio, you get in this car, you get in this van. And personally, I was in Cuba in 1995, and I travelled up and down the country hitching through this system. And just, even today in Cuba, they have a new fuel crisis, which is a direct result of the Trump administration's really tightening, very punitive sanctions, threatening shipping tankers that are, taking oil to Cuba. They're going to fine them. Then they threaten their insurance companies and the insurance companies, and it just goes on. And, people still move around Cuba hitching, and, people stop and they help each other, people they don't know, because that's part of the consciousness that they have from that period. And yeah.
So talking about the economic system and economic policy also takes us back to your first book, which is on Che Guevara and his contribution to the economic debate both in Cuba but also internationally. I think people would be surprised to learn that Che Guevara was such an intellectual who basically read so many different things and taught these things as well to his comrades in Cuba. So what would you say are the main points of emphasis when it comes to his view on how to run an economic system?
Oh, I mean, this is the topic of my PhD in my first book, but I'll try and synthesize it in a few words. I mean, you're right. So when I was doing my PhD, I'd say, I'm doing a PhD on Che Guevara's economic ideas. And most people would say, I didn't know he had any economic ideas. In fact, he really studied Marxism, had a very critical view. So I tend to try and sort of characterize his influences from three different strands. So the first was his reading of Marx, but not just Capital. He read Capital, and there's fascinating stories about, the sort of socialist bloc exchange. So after the Cuban Revolution, the Soviet Union sent a professor to give Marxism classes to the leadership of the Cuban government. And Che Guevara asked him to come to the Ministry of Industries when he was minister from February 1961. And they did sessions in the Ministry of Industry. And some of my favorite interviews, like the stuff that I heard that, it hadn't really been written about before, was these sessions. So they'd start at like 9 at night. So after the working day. And often they went on to 4 a.m. And apparently this professor was at his wit's end with Che. He was pulling his hair out because Che Guevara was so rigorous and critical of everything that was being said. And he used to read Capital and say, look at the role of the operation of the law of value. How can then the Soviet, manual of political economy says we must use the law of value to develop socialism? He says this is a contradiction. So this was, debates that took place were described as sort of boxing matches, and really shows his penetrating analysis. And he wouldn't just accept what someone said. He'd want to drill deeper into it. So the first was Marxism. The second source of knowledge or influence was from the debates that were taking place contemporaneously in the socialist bloc. So this is a moment when, there's a lot of economic stagnation and lower productivity and so on. And the response in most socialist countries is to make, as Che Guevara conceived it, make concessions to the market. So instead of getting to the root of the problem and saying, well, why are these things happening? Why is production or productivity low? Why is there a lack of incentives? Why are workers absent? And so on. Instead of trying to deal with it within the socialist framework, it was always opening more spaces to market mechanisms. So he was aware of those comments. For example, he said, I think it was 1962, someone had asked him, do you know about the debates in the Polish latest Communist Party Congress? He said, do you know about the new system? He said, I know that new system. I knew it from Argentina. It's called capitalism. So, he had, although there's the language issue, and obviously the material he had would have been limited. He did read in French. I'm not sure about English, but certainly Spanish, of course. He was aware of those debates. Now, the third influence, which is really interesting and surprises people, is he was very aware and interested in some of the capitalist technologies and administrative procedures that he saw in Cuba. So Cuba was, the headquarters of some companies, US-owned companies. When they were nationalized in Cuba, Che Guevara was at that point the head of the Department of Industrialization, and he personally got all the documents from these companies, these US companies, and he studied them and examined them, and he noticed that they used a kind of centralized budgeting system. So, for example, if the headquarters in New York had to send material to a subsidiary in Cuba, they would not charge to make a profit from it because it's one company. So he looked at that and he said, well, if that makes sense under capitalism, it makes more sense under socialism. And as a consequence of these ideas, but also the practical experience of trying to manage industry in this context. So things are being nationalized overnight, right? They were having these all-night meetings and suddenly it would be announced that 200 US companies were now nationalized. And that meant that they had to find 200 administrators the next morning to run these companies. They had to be people who had some basic economics or managerial experience, people who were loyal to the revolution, and it was really hard. And this is why I tell the story in my book about when they nationalized a whole load of sugar refineries, sugar industry. They ended up putting a bunch of teenagers, taking them from a boarding school where they were getting, an intense training and saying temporarily they have to take over because, in the first years of the revolution, 1 million people left Cuba and they were the bourgeoisie, basically. They were the people who managed, they were the professionals, they were the wealthy, and they left Cuba. So the Cubans were trying to take over a state, dismantle the old apparatus, create a new apparatus with, an average literacy level that was terrible. And that hence, the immediate investments in education. So Che Guevara developed something called the budgetary finance system, which borrowed from, those US capitalist efficiencies, but within the socialist framework, with the within the Marxist theory as well. And it was a unique system for the transition, economic management for the transition to socialism. It was a unique system for the socialist countries. And Fidel Castro gave him the freedom, the institutional and ideological freedom to develop his system. Meanwhile, in other industries, they had basically adapted the Soviet system of management and planning. So it was very interesting, created the institutional conditions for something called the Great Debate. And the Great Debate took place in Cuba between 1963 and 1965. And it was a debate about which economic management system was most appropriate to Cuban conditions for the transition to socialism and then communism. And, it focused on different elements. There was differences in terms of incentives and consciousness, differences in terms of the role of the bank and finance, and should there be credit and interest, and organizational differences. How should you get people, workers, and enterprises to produce more? Do you use material incentives? Do you use administrative mechanisms? And so on. So Che Guevara, not only did he have economic ideas, he was in a very rare position to be able to turn them into policies, to sort of test his ideas in practice. And that was what was so fascinating.
Thank you. Cuba has gone back and forth in terms of more market, more planning, less planning, and throughout the years there's been a swinging of this pendulum. Where would you say things stand now, and what would Che say about this?
Well, the first thing to say is that where Cuba swings in this pendulum is determined not just by domestic conditions, it's actually more determined by international conditions. And in general, even people who feel, Cubans, I'm talking about Cuban economists and analysts, who feel that Che was idealist, they still associate Che's proposals and Che's systems with the vitality of socialism. They just feel that Cuba is too underdeveloped to be able to, implement, to depend on the administrative levers rather than financial levers and so on. At the moment, Cuba has swung in the pendulum away from Guevara's ideas, but then the international conditions couldn't really be much worse. And what I mean by that is Cuba has, lost its fraternal partnership with the Soviet bloc. That collapsed. It was isolated. Obviously Cuba's existed the Cuban revolutionary state has existed for longer since the collapse of the Soviet bloc than before. And, it's really interesting. You read all that Cubanology literature and it says Cuba only survives because of the Soviet Union. And then by the time I wrote my book, it had been around for longer without. Where it has allies like Venezuela, the trade with Venezuela was very trade and cooperation, because there was a lot of development aid and assistance, mutually beneficial exchange, oil for doctors and so on. But Venezuela has been the target of terrible sanctions and attack as well. And in fact, there were statements from the first Trump administration where they were clear. They were saying, we'll attack Venezuela, we'll attack Nicaragua, and then Cuba will fall. So then, during the first Trump administration, he introduced 243 new sanctions, coercive measures and actions against Cuba, including during the pandemic. So when the UN and other bodies were saying, please, can countries rescind sanctions that affect a country's capacity to deal with this pandemic, to save lives, and the US was adding sanctions which directly affected Cuba's capacity to save lives. And it was one of the first times that it was really clear that the US blockade is genocidal, that it kills people in Cuba. Because often people have said to me, well, they have a blockade, but it can't be that serious because where are the deaths? So you look at, in the 1990s, UK-US sanctions on Iraq, and, the UN was saying 150 children are dying every day because of those sanctions. And they look at Cuba and there's no equivalent. But that's because Cuba's a socialist state. And so it's used its resources to protect the population. That was the first Trump administration. Biden came in on his campaign. He had said he would revert those measures and go back to, he was vice president to Obama, who restored diplomatic relations and introduced rapprochement. But he did nothing. He was obviously told, his advisors told him, Cuba's close to collapse, because that was the impact of COVID, which was hard hitting for Cuba. They lost the tourism revenue. They had the first violent protests in 2021. I was in Cuba when that happened. It was really, shocking for Cuba, but a really minimal sort of spark if you compare it to anywhere else in the world. And now Trump has come back in and he continues with this maximum pressure strategy. He doesn't want to just pressure Cuba. They want to see the collapse of the Cuban government. And at any cost, they really do not care about the human cost for Cubans. Any talk about, we support the Cuban people, we want them free, is absolute rubbish, because the situation in Cuba, particularly with electricity, is back as it was or worse than during the special period. I've just been to Cuba. I was there this summer. It's bad in Havana. There's long blackouts. But outside Havana, some places have an hour and a half of electricity a day. Some places have 4 hours on, 4 hours off, 8 hours off, 4 hours on. And if people hear the electricity go on at 3 a.m, they have to get up at 3 a.m, and do their washing and do their cooking and do, whatever it is, charge their phones, charge everything. Cuba is in a really difficult place. And so many of these measures are designed to impact the government. And it's been a conscious policy. So the Cuban government, cannot make transactions in the international banking system. But some of the sanctions have been designed to help private enterprise. So it's kind of forced their hand in that sense. The only way they can get, the Cubans need financial resources. We could say capital. They need money for investment to rebuild their infrastructure, to invest in the social welfare system. Where can they get money from? They are excluded from all international financial institutions because of the blockade. They cannot get money from development banks. They can't get loans. They can't, even during COVID, the difference between Cuba and the rest of the world is they had no access to emergency funds and lender of last resort. So the only mechanisms that they have to get financial resources is remittances and foreign direct investment. And foreign direct investors are being persecuted, they're being identified and persecuted, threatened with fines. So FDI has gone down massively in Cuba, and remittances, the US has put a cap on remittances, but remittances, the idea of allowing people to have self-employment and small private businesses it also encourages people to send remittances into Cuba. So at least you're getting financial resources in. The state can then capture those and use those in the international market to when, sometimes they have to buy things up front in cash. They have to make transactions under the radar. The blockade is so intense now that if I, as a British citizen with a British bank account, try to send a £1 transaction to you, you're in the European Union, right? And I put the word Cuba in the transaction, even though it hasn't been transferred into dollars, even though it's not going to Cuba, that transaction will be blocked. So then you ask yourself, how does Cuba get anything into the country? How do they manage to do any exports at all? Because the US dollar is, 90% of transactions, more or less, internationally are carried out in the US dollar. The US dollar is the international currency, but they also have the right to decide who can and can't hold their currency. So it's a terrible situation for Cuba, and they are being forced to make more concessions to the market, and that's what we're seeing. But I would still say they've maintained the fundamentals of a socialist system. Economically, they still have planning, they still have a majority state control of property, and majority of people who are employed in Cuba work for the state sector. And they're incredible, what they call the triumphs of the revolution, the healthcare, their education, the free provision provided through the state.
Well, let me take a step back maybe and finish our conversation with a question on what it's like doing research in Cuba. So what is it like for a researcher such as you to go into Cuba? What is it like working with Cuban intellectuals, professors, working in Cuban archives? And how did you get started? How did you get interested in
I actually went to live in Cuba when I was 18. I just finished my A-levels, my pre-university exams, and my sister had visited Cuba on a Solidarity Brigade, and she was fascinated. She went in 1994, which was the worst year of the special period, so the economy had plummeted. And yet it was such a vibrant, dynamic society, and it sort of took everything we knew from capitalist or imperialist Britain and turned it on its head. So she said, look, why don't we go and live in Cuba for a year? So we did. And I think, people have often asked this question about research as if there's an assumption that it's difficult for, maybe because I'm a Westerner, to go into Cuba and do research. And it may have been more difficult, I don't know, in previous decades, but I have never had a problem. It's true that if I talk to Cubans, I now speak Spanish with a Cuban accent, which helps. And I can say to them, I lived in Cuba in this period, but I've never had any obstacles to doing research. I literally, when I did my PhD research on Che Guevara and his work in Cuba, I did, nearly 80 interviews with more than 50 people who worked with Che. Many of them had never given interviews before. Most of them have died since then because it was 20 years ago and they were, already quite old, 70s and 80s. But I would just turn up and with my reporter, and there was no vetting process. I didn't need permission. My transcripts weren't revised, and that's continued in that way. I mean, there may be people who say that's not their experience. And it's also true that people go to Cuba with an agenda and they request access to prisons or, Communist Party archives and so on, and with the intention of writing in a hostile way about Cuba. I think that some of my work is critical about certain aspects, and I think actually the Cubans appreciate that because I'm able to have a debate with them and a discussion. I think there's a misconception that you can't criticize, but actually I would challenge anyone who's listening to this to read some of the speeches by Fidel Castro and Raúl. And really, you couldn't be much more critical than they have been about their own revolutionary society. I would encourage anyone who wants to go to Cuba to do it. I think Cubans are very trusting. They have a very open door policy. The obstacles you'll have to doing research are to do with the materials and the facilities. So I was once trusted in the Che Guevara Study Center. They gave me the transcripts of their internal meetings of the Ministry of Industries that happened every 2 months. Huge, big document. They only had 1 copy. And they trusted me to go. I said, please, I can't. I'm only here for, 4 months. I don't have time to just read this 1 document. Please let me go and copy it. And they trusted me to go and do that. And I found a photocopier, but no paper. And then I found paper, but no ink. And then, so those are more likely to be, the obstacles are to be, the material conditions in Cuba. But yeah, I mean, I now have PhD students. They've had fantastic experiences doing research in Cuba. So if anyone's thinking about it, go ahead.
Professor Yaffe, thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me to do the interview.
Slušali ste Politološki podcast u produkciji Hrvatskog politološkog društva. Razgovor vodio Marko Grdešić, urednik i glazba Enes Kulenović, pomoć u realizaciji Marko Grdešić i Karlo Kralj.